Thank you all for creating time to be with us this evening. As Nicodemus has introduced me, I'm a clinical psychologist who has been practicing for some time. I interact with children, adolescents, and adults on a daily basis in my clinic. And I think before I dive into the presentation, I like talk about certain facts or some statistics. Now, around the time of COVID, around 2020, the World Health Organization had warned that mental health conditions are increasing worldwide, and had urged countries to invest more in mental health treatment. By then, of course, we know what was happening, and it's not a surprise that because of the isolation and the anxiety of COVID, definitely people were emotionally and psychologically stressed. However, despite these requests, in our country, Kenya, and many sub-Saharan countries, a mere 0.01 budget allocation is actually directed to management of mental health issues. Then we wonder then why or how or when is the help going to come from government? The reality is that this is something that has been there for a while, and that is why I am extremely delighted to be part of this team. I am extremely happy that the Lavington Seventh-day Adventist Church has taken the initiative to actually focus on a very key area. And I like the name, Possibility Ministries. That is amazing. And I have to commend the church for taking the forefront, being on the forefront in making sure that we focus on really not only understanding, but coming up with community-based programs that will not only help us diagnose, identify these problems, but most importantly, understand the people who have these conditions and support them. And now to my presentation, and you'll allow me to use the sliders that I have here. Neurodivergent. What is neurodivergent? When you think about that, the simplest definition that comes to mind is that the brain of a person who's neurodivergent works differently. So it works differently, and you think differently. And you will find that the easiest analogy to describe neurodivergent is to think of an orchestra. The brain of someone who's neurodivergent is like an orchestra where there is the alto, soprano, bass. There's a musical instrument like the very lovely presentation that has been done, or was done before this particular conversation. And you find that the brain is unable to narrow down and focus on, for example, just singing bass. So you find that the brain starts singing bass, and then it gets distracted and it goes to alto, and then soprano. Then they start watching and getting excited by the musical instruments, and they drift away. And that is a good demonstration of how, sadly, sometimes people who are neurodivergent are unable to actually fit in a systemic environment, which I will discuss shortly. Having said that, when we talk about neurodivergent, we need to go back to the beginning. That for sure, anyone who says they are neurodivergent, or when people talk about neurodivergent, people are basically using that word for purposes of advocacy, for purposes of making sure that people hear them and say, yes, we are different. And you need to appreciate that even the way we learn We need a different way of going about things. We need the system to be changed or to be adjusted to meet our needs. We need, for example, when you go to class, to have a class where we can actually be helped to be in a small environment with few students, so that at least people can actually give us individualized attention so that we can learn, because perhaps grasping might be, concepts might be not the same as someone who's not neurodivergent. Therefore, the real word that we should use is neurodevelopmental conditions. And this neurodevelopmental condition, that is a clinical terminology that we use so that we can actually be able to identify and manage these conditions in our society. And a list of these conditions is one, the autism spectrum conditions, which might also include something called Asperger's. Then there's attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And these conditions have what I would call cousins or brothers: learning difficulties, the dyslexias of this world, the problems with coordination, and sometimes also neurological issues that would accompany these conditions. And most importantly, also, you'll find that in these neurodevelopmental conditions, many people might also have problems with not only coordination, but controlling their impulse. So they might find themselves getting easily stimulated and saying things without thinking. For example, in class, the teacher would be teaching, and because the teacher has mentioned a topic that the child is very conversant with, the child, even before the teacher finishes asking the question, the child has raised their hand, or they have answered their own question. And you can imagine the kind of trouble that children will get into. And of course, action. And you'll find this kind of youngsters in constant trouble, because they will do things without really thinking about the consequences that come as a result of their behavior. Therefore, why then neurodivergent? Why is this topic important to us? It is important because the opposite of neurodivergent is neurotypical. Therefore, you'll find that those people who are not neurodivergent in our society are described as neurotypical. Their brain function is considered to be standard or typical. Now, the problem with this is that the neurodivergent person is unable to fit in a system that is neurotypical. For example, our educational system. You go to our educational system, perhaps there are streams. We know that education is free. You find 5 or 7 streams that has 50 students or 70 students. A child who's neurodivergent, the moment they step into that class, they are stepping into chaos. Because one, the way they think, like I've demonstrated, is like an orchestra. So they enter in that class, and in their brains, the part of the brain that is responsible for organizing, the part of the brain that is responsible for focus, the part of the brain that is responsible for being able to regulate your emotions, is overstimulated at that moment, or understimulated in that sense. And as a result, you'll find this child will either always be labeled, will either always be in trouble, and will always possibly lag behind in class, na atakuwa tu yuko tu. And as a result of this, you're finding then people are now becoming more and more vocal about neurodivergent. They're saying we need a space, we need to be listened to, we need to be appreciated, that we are an important part of this society. And because neurodivergent is on a continuum Because when it comes to assessing and diagnosing these conditions, you'll find that in 2013, the manual that is used to diagnose these conditions was changed. And they said that neurodivergent conditions are actually from very mild, moderate to severe. So you can be anywhere on that scale. So you might find someone who is autistic, for example, but has very mild symptoms of autism. And they are very good in certain areas. Therefore, you'll find that what will stand out in this person is intense focus. Either they are ADHD or have autism. You'll find that they will actually be able to identify areas that they have interest in. Let's say, for example, maths or languages, and they will focus so much in that at the expense of other subjects. And that then, sometimes you've seen in society that even people who are neurodivergent will get so engrossed in something, they'll even forget to eat. They might even forget to sleep. There are incidents where people have even stayed for 3 days without sleeping. And we all know the consequence of that. And sadly, you'll find that these are the people who might be misdiagnosed by us professionals as either having bipolar mood disorder or having depression. And yet the reality is that this person tends to put in so much energy and effort in some things that are interesting at the expense of other areas. Another thing that would stand out in people who are neurodivergent is that they will easily find themselves having problems regulating their emotions. And as a result, they can as well also be misdiagnosed with similar conditions. They have problems with communication. This is very common. In severe cases, you'll find that people might not be able to even have eye contact or establish eye contact. They might not be able to express what they need, they want. They might have problems with human interaction. They might be very sensitive to sound, might be very sensitive to touch. And as a result, then, they can actually easily be isolated. And within those environments that are systemic, you'll find that they have no place and there is no one who can speak on their behalf. Consequently, the consequence to this is educational problems. You as a parent will be called to school. You as a child will always be exposed to anxiety. You as a child, you'll always be find yourself being exposed to punishment. And that sadly then becomes the beginning of exposure to emotional and psychological problems, which might include even trauma at a very early age. So, having said this, and I think I had to stay there for some time, this issue of neurodivergent is a word that has been coined to actually push for advocacy. But the real conditions are these that I'm talking about, the neurocognitive or neurodevelopmental conditions that start very early, and they persist into teenagehood and into adulthood. And I think as we continue, I will be able to demonstrate to you the impact that comes as a result of us not being able to identify or diagnose these conditions early. One of the things I like doing is to contextualize some of these conversations that we have, because most of the literature is from the West. For example, a lot of research that has been done says globally 15 to 20% of individuals, and that is straight off the internet, has this neurocognitive condition. So if we narrow down and use those statistics, it was clear that in Kenya, maybe about 8-9+ million Kenyans have this condition. Think about wale watu wako nyumbani huko Bungoma, Busia, Kisii, Meru, Mombasa, border huko ya Tanzania na wapi, they are clueless about this. Kenya Institute of Special Education is very good when it comes to screening and assessment of these conditions. However, we don't have capacity. So that is why I'm so happy that we are talking about such things. And the more we speak about them, the more people will listen, the more people will relate, because I can assure you, going by those numbers, you must actually be thinking in your mind, there must be one or two people who might actually be having these problems. Now, to contextualize this, the impact of neurodivergent persons in a society, I'll give an example. Let's say a child who is thriving in academics, and I think in a society, we focus a lot in academia. We will think that this child, of course, is content, is creative, and as a matter of fact, as a parent, you might push this child to even do better, to outsmart themselves, to do better than their sisters or their brothers, and so forth and so on. But the reality is that you might not know that this child is neurodivergent until you get an assessment. You might say this child is very clever and so forth and so on. But the reality is that, sadly, this child perhaps at a very early age is being given a lot of pressure. They like certain areas of education. And the more you give them pressure, then with time they withdraw. And they don't know what they do. Say, this son of mine is going to be an engineer, or this son of mine or daughter of mine is going to be a scientist, and so forth and so on. Not knowing that this child is just presenting neurodivergent symptoms of actually being so hyper-focused or focused on an area that is of interest. The downside is what? If we don't do something about it early, because obviously statistics show again, at least over 80% of students, by the time they get to college, they're not so sure what they want to do. In fact, you find students will say, I'll go and do music, and then they change their mind. Very few have an idea of what they want to do. So on the flip side, you will find that there are also those students who are struggling in academics. And sadly, these are the ones in a society we'll identify very easily. The other one that I've given you the example, pressure. Exposing pressure to the child at a very early age, not knowing that they are neurodivergent. This other one who speaks very early, huyu mtoto ni mlazy, hataki kufanya homework. Then over time, you try to help this child with math. You've beaten them so many times. Unfortunately, they've gone for tutoring. You're spending so much money. Then, huyu ni stupid. Huyu ana pretend. They are a malingara. And sadly, also in a society, we might end up saying this child must be bewitched, and possibly they need to go somewhere and get whatever people do when they are taken to witch doctors. The consequence of that, unfortunately, is that in our families, you'll see a lot of family discord. Mzazi atasema in our culture, mtoto kwa sababu ni mwerevu ni wangu. Wale wengine ambao you have labeled as stupid, and yes, they are neurodivergent, ni wako. The beginning of problems. And we see that all the time. You start seeing oppositional defiance behavior in children. I don't want to go deep into that in the interest of time. But you see a child, doesn't want to go to school, mara amepoteza vitabu, mara nachapa watoto, mara they are sadly killing even animals, you know. They are hiding their laptops so that you don't go to work and do what you're supposed to do. You're finding that their performance, and that is one classic thing that is usually there, you start seeing their performance just going down, going down, going down. A child then starts refusing school. And we've seen many dropouts. You see someone amefika class 8 and say, hey, school is so difficult. I don't think I can continue. And for sure you agree, because the child has been flunking. So what do? Okay, what do you want to do? Business? And surprisingly, what we might not know, and I think we've been talking about it on the streets and we see it in the newspaper, some of the most successful people in our society don't even have a class 4 certificate. Wale wa zamani, or class 8. the people we call street smart, the people who have the gift of the gab, and they are able to actually find their way anywhere. Those could be neurodivergent people who the society shunned and said, wewe endo uze maka. And surprisingly, they are the ones who start employing the thriving neurotypical individuals. So this conversation again is extremely important, because when we start identifying these conditions early, we are able to actually secure the future of these children who might unfortunately suffer for many years to come. And of course, if we persist, like the example I've given you of the very clever student who now, because of the pressures, perhaps is starting to have difficulties in performance and slowly catching up with this other child who had been identified. You as parents, you are fighting. The child also starts, doesn't want to let parents down, doesn't want to let teachers down, because he's the darling of the teachers and everyone. He's always in number one. But now, because of the pressures, because of the fact that now they are growing and realizing that the subject that they were really interested in is not what they really wanted, now they're redirecting the energies, anaanza kuwa na shida. Unaanza kumpatia pressure. And then you know what happens? The children start engaging. And this is now during teenagehood. They start engaging in what you call maladaptive coping. Very common nowadays in boys, you will see gaming. The child will isolate via the computer, and they'll become very good in computers. Anything you ask them about the computers, they'll tell you everything that you need to know. Then you start finding that they will slowly start sipping kinywaji, anavuta bangi, anasema, hey, that is helping me focus, that is helping me calm down. And they are responding to what? The environment. So I want you to picture a child who is growing up. Picture a child who is highly functional autism, Asperger's. Picture a child who has attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Those are the kind of children I am talking about. And they say with ADHD, 5 to 7% of the population has ADHD. With autism, perhaps a very few number, maybe I think out of major population, I can't have the number, it's very minimal, but that is the one that is almost moderate to severe. That is obvious sometimes to see big. But what about highly functional autism? Many adults in this society have always struggled with functional high functioning autism, which has never been diagnosed. Those are the people I'm talking about. So unapata mtu anatumia kinywaji and you feel much more calm and focused, and your life seems to be thriving. But unfortunately, we all know, or if you don't know, that these substance problems is a progressive problem. With time, it starts affecting many other functioning, including your body organs, and it might end up not being very helpful or sustainable with time. So the question, therefore, is, again, I think I have 15 minutes. What are these neurodivergent conditions? I think I'd mentioned earlier. I think I have demonstrated to all of you how progressively these conditions, neurodivergent conditions, if not understood, if people are not supported early, then can lead to problems in future. Now, I am sure there are one or two people who would want to really know a little bit more about these conditions. And I will summarize because there are many. And I'll talk about some that come together, some that actually just present individually. And the first one I'll talk about is attention deficit disorder. Like I've said, it's a condition that starts in childhood, and you will find that children with ADHD will tend to have three set of symptoms or that will stand out. One of the symptoms that will stand out, set of symptoms, is that of impulsivity. And I think I'd mentioned that earlier on. The second one is problems with inattention. And inattention does not mean that they seek for attention. It's just that their mind tends to drift easily, like the orchestra example or analogy I was giving you. So you're in class, the teacher is teaching, your mind wanders. The teacher asks you a question you're not able to remember. of course, we know the obvious consequence to that. Then the other set of symptoms is that of combined subtype, whereby you have a child will have symptoms of inattention, impulsivity, and they are basically combined, and hyperactivity rather. So hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention together. And I think if you get time, in the interest of time, because I cannot go deep into that, you can actually go and look at that. The thing here that stands out is that you'll find that there are a number of individuals, especially girls, who might not have these symptoms, because you'll find boys tend to be more of hyper, and that is why you pick them early, the symptoms early. But with girls, you might find that the symptoms might be there, but they will start becoming an issue when they get to high school. ADHD also, there are people who also have autism and ADHD, features of autism and ADHD. And these are the people who might tend to seem like they are very well put together, but you'll find that they might have emotional issues, emotional regulation. They might have an interest in organizing things. So you'll find that people unfortunately label them quirky. Those people are very quirky. So you'll find that someone who's been very rigid, they like being regimented, counting things, and that sometimes might waste a lot of their time. People in society might regard them as OCD. Now that, if assessed, you might find that that person might have features of autism and ADHD, and that needs to be addressed. When it's not addressed, then this person continues having challenges in the society. And of course, having said that, these conditions will come with other challenges. But allow me, before I talk about the challenges, about autism. Because I think autism, like I said, is on a spectrum, and you'll find that there is what that is very obvious. It's like when you talk about diabetes or blood pressure. When you go to the doctor is able to pick that very quickly because you're having certain symptoms. So the same with severe autism. It is easy to pick, where you find that the child, from the early stages of growth and development, maybe around 3 years, you are noticing as a parent the child is not developing language. The child maybe is repeating certain words, what we call echolalia. You're finding the child emotionally, they are not getting regulated. You might find that the child is throwing a lot of tantrums, they get frustrated, they are sensitive to sound. You find the child may be closing the ears. You find a child may be getting obsessed with circular things or sockets or things, certain things that they really have an interest in, and they are always finding themselves spending a lot of time there. And you find a child then perhaps also having an interest in certain areas whereby they might be very, very exceptionally good. It could be music, it could be in maths, and so forth and so on. And there are certain words that were used to describe children who have autism, but I don't want to go into that because those words are not so very good, but that is in the past. So that is autism. And you'll find that, like I said, it's on a spectrum. You'll find highly functional autism. And in these people are highly functional autistic, you'll find that they are able to function just like any other person, but then now they might be limited in certain areas of engaging in social activities. So these are the people who might have problems with going for parties. These are the people who will get so anxious when they go outside because they were obsessed with counting, wanting to maybe stick to a certain path every day. They might have problems with changing that path that they are using. And as a result, they might have challenges even with engaging in activities that need intellectual stimulation or focus. So you'll find that these are the children who might, they themselves get frustrated because no one is understanding them, or no one from an early age was able to pick that and then redirect their energies in the areas of their strength. So focusing on strengths is extremely important in these individuals who are neurodivergent, because when we talk about ADHD, when we talk about autism and all that, we need to actually be able to identify what are the strengths of these individuals and how can we help them. The last point, like I wanted to say, you'll find that these individuals will have other conditions that might have to do with problems with writing, problems with coordination, problems with reading, problems with comprehension, problems with understanding numbers. So it is again important not to really force a child, like I said earlier, to do math over and over and over again. And yet, honestly, this child is really struggling because they are seeing those numbers. When you subject them those numbers, they are seeing them inverted. Sasa wewe utamchapa, utamuita hizo labels nimesema, na sadly now the self-esteem of this child is affected, the motivation of this child is affected, then this child emotional regulation. You'd wonder why they don't want to go to school, why they don't want to engage with you, and then the list continues on and on and on. And I think I've already mentioned some of the negative coping mechanisms that might come as a result of that. The last point, about 9 minutes, is when it comes to these conditions, I know we are living in a society where it's very fashionable for us to self-diagnose, for us to drop certain names or words. And I think I like to urge us to be very careful, because sometimes when you do a lot of that, is you risk making this particular subject matter to be taken with the seriousness that it deserves. So you find that when we talk about something over and over again, and you find that everyone is an expert by their own right, and that is a fact, then we can find ourselves as even professionals not doing harm than good. And that is where collaboration or working together with professionals comes in, and the community, because we need to do this together. We're in this together. And one thing that is extremely important when it comes to screening, assessment, and treatment of these conditions is to ensure that you work with a multidisciplinary team. What do I mean by this? When it comes to identifying or confirming that this is a problem, you need the input of a neurologist sometimes. You need the input of a general practitioner who is a doctor. You might need because they interact a lot at a primary level with the people who might be having certain problems. You need the input of a pediatrician. You need the input of a psychologist and a psychiatrist. You may need the input of an occupational therapist. You can imagine how then this affair can become extremely expensive. And that is why we hope that government and other agencies can come together, and including the church and churches, to be able to actually push the agenda of making sure that we are supported, to ensure that as people think about programs of managing like the church is doing, then we don't leave out those people who might need this specialized management. So when we talk about this multidisciplinary team, everyone then has a role to play. In first of all, ensuring, for example, as a psychologist, I'm able to now coordinate the screening. There are tools that we use to confirm that for sure someone has this problem. Taking the history of an individual to be sure that, yes, for sure this problem has been there from childhood, and it is persisting, and it's consistent, and it's affecting different areas of someone's functioning and the people around the environment. Those are some of the markers that professionals will look for, not to just say, I think based on these symptoms, this person has ADHD, or based on this symptom. No, it is a systematic process involving teachers. This person must have or present these symptoms in not only one environment, not only at home, at school or any other area, maybe in the supermarket. When they go to the supermarket, they are unable to regulate their emotions, they're picking everything, they're throwing tantrums. That is the complexity or the complexity of this condition. And it deserves the seriousness when it comes to identifying it, and not really just dropping names and saying that I think I am neurodivergent, for example, or I have Asperger's or whatever and so forth and so on. Get to interact with professionals. And sometimes also, if you're not able to really afford, we professionals, sometimes if you reach out to us, you'll be surprised. We are able to help you do an assessment and be able to direct you to the right places that you can actually get support. And most importantly, even like now, the Ministry of Labor, they've been registering people who perhaps are neurodivergent and might be need to be exempted from certain taxations and so forth and so on. So we should be aware of this and take advantage of this, because I think also, as much as 0.01 is what I've been focusing on, the government is doing what it has to do. Anyway, having said that, I think when it comes to the community, it is extremely important for the community to do what they have to do, because we are few professionals and we would want to ensure that we work together. Because many a times when people come to me, if for sure I notice that the symptoms are mild to moderate, I immediately try and see how we can actually work from the community and not from my office. So my hope and desire is that we will continue having such conversations so that we can finally ensure that, apart from the multidisciplinary team that I have described, we, the community, can be proactive with information, and we can be able to ensure that those in the community come out without any stigma, and they will be able to get the help and be able to live with dignity moving forward.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. I was asking, how can we help them when we use maybe diet? Is there any way that we can help them? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I have actually, if I was to speak as a scientist, I would say I have no remarks to make. But the reality is that I have seen many people who come and say, no, at this point, we don't want to use any medication. And I encourage that if the symptoms are mild and moderate, the first line of intervention is really what you call a behavioral program, and making sure that you tailor-make the environment to ensure that also, for example, the school environment is able to accommodate this child. When it comes to diet, I've seen a number of positives, especially when parents are able to maybe manage the children, the intake of wheat, this sugary stuff and so forth. It actually does make a difference in some individuals. So I think that is the much I can say. I don't know that there's a nutritionist, because that's something I didn't mention, because many times also nutritionists are involved. One of the challenges you'll find in the society we live in is unknowingly parents have exposed their children to sugary foods and so forth and so on. And when it comes to now managing that, it can be a little bit tricky. But you find that there are parents who start very early, and I encourage parents, when you start early, then you get to engage this child or get them into a certain routine. And you have what we call cheat days. So maybe over the weekend they can have a soda here, and you can actually tell there's a difference even in how they're behaving. So the answer to that question is yes, diet does make a difference. But how we go about it is extremely important, again, because sometimes you can traumatize the child by forcing them into a program, and yet they were so used to a certain way of doing things. I can see another question here on the chat. Dr. Oigara, thank you so much for the Amazing expose. Most of the audience here handle children in church, and we would appreciate a few pointers to support us on how to manage them while in class. And I think this could be a conversation for another day. I think maybe through Nicodemus, I'm very much willing to organize a day that we could come with my team, and we can actually spend the afternoon, whatever time you give us, to be able to discuss this matter at length. So I think we can take this up after this conversation. Thank you, Mokembo, for that very important, nice, lovely question. Thank you. Okay, I'm seeing another question. Janet Nguru, do children, adults outgrow those problems, and at what point should we see the doctor? Extremely good question. Now, when you talk about neurodevelopment or neurocognitive, you are born with it, and it's a condition that you will have for many, many years to come. However, the good news is, with early diagnosis, when you recognize it early and you put certain measures in place, like now routine, make sure that someone has a routine, make sure that someone is able to have a sleep hygiene, make sure that you identify the person's strengths and you redirect energies to those strengths so that they can actually be motivated to do the things that are mundane, then it does make a difference. Actually, studies show that, and even not only studies, even from experience, we've seen that when you start early, people internalize these skills and they make them part of their lives, and the symptoms are managed very well. So that is a very important thing. Starting early, identifying this. So at what point should you see the doctor? The sooner the better. If you can see a clinician or a doctor who's able to assess and say, okay, now, based on this is what we recommend, and you start putting that in place, the sooner we do it, the better. Yeah. Thank you, Janet. Any other question?
Yes, there's another question in the chat. What are some of the adjustments that you can recommend in church to set up to accommodate this diversity?
I think when you talk about adjustments, I think what will be important is to do a needs assessment first, to really understand how the setting is and so forth and so on. And I think it's going by the other question that's been asked. So I'm very much available. I think today is just a beginning, a conversation. And I think we can set up a conversation so that we can sit and really understand how is the system, and what do we need to do differently? Because I don't want to make any assumptions, and no one shoe size fits all.
Thank you. Shall we pray? Mighty and everlasting God who is in heaven, tonight we are grateful. Indeed, so grateful that you've granted us an opportunity to listen in. Thank you for Dr. Lambert, who has ably taken us through this session, and we want to pray for your abundant blessings upon him. Thank you, Lord, because you have created everybody of us special, and even for the children that we are thinking about, thank you that you have given them special abilities. It's my prayer that every family, every parent that has children like this will receive your abundant grace in taking care of them. May you give them the resources, may you give them the empowerment, may you give them the community around them, including us as teachers and the church, to support them in taking care of these children. Thank you, Lord, for everybody who joined. I pray for blessings upon them. May you lead us through the remainder of the week until we see each other probably on Sabbath or sometime soon. For this is our prayer. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.